All right, so you can see the pictures and you can hear me.
Yes.
Off we go. Let's go. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation from Nebraska. I wish I could be there. It'd be a lot more fun to see everybody's faces, but we'll do it this way and we'll make it work. What I want to talk about tonight is the idea. Let me back up. I have two slides that look the same. About prairies, I want to how because those of listening to this president know a lot about prairies, but even then, and about prairies, what do you just think about these large, expansive reaches of prairie? I'm lucky to be in Nebraska where we have the Nebraska Sandhills. It's basically 12 million acres of contiguous intact prairie. It's spectacular. Um, or you might think about distinctive birds that live in the prairies. That's probably something that Audubon folks think about. You might think about bison, either past or present, and how they interact with grasslands. You might think about floral diversity and beauty. But that's because we are people who know prairies, and we're sort of a minority. Well, we are a minority because I think most people, when they think about grasslands, they think about these flat, boring fields full of grass, or maybe just a landscape that doesn't have anything of interest, especially if you don't recognize plants. So those of you who understand or know prairie plants can probably find things in here that are recognizable to you, but most people don't see that. So there's just not anything that they care about. And that's a big problem for those of us doing prairie conservation, because if people aren't interested in prairies, if they're not inspired by prairies, then really nothing that I do as a prairie conservationist is going to make any difference. And I think we make a mistake sometimes of when we try to convince people that prairies are interesting or important, we hit them over the head immediately with why prairies are of utility to us, right? How they can help people. So clean water and carbon and the history of them and value of pollinators, all those things are important. There's no objection to the fact that they're important. But I think that when you start a conversation by spouting facts at someone, it's not usually the most effective conversation. So what we do when we talk to people, about any topic, when we introduce yourself to someone for the first time, it's usually around storytelling. So we introduce ourselves, we talk about where we're from or what the weather's doing or something like that, right? There's some sort of a storytelling aspect to that. And I think we need to apply that to the way we talk to people about prairies to get them interested. So, for example, one of the best ways that we've been able to engage people in conservation lately, I think, is through the monarch butterfly. Because the monarch butterfly is recognizable, it's fairly large for an insect, especially. People know what it is, and they care about the fate of the monarch butterfly, which means that we can engage them in a conversation about why plant diversity matters and why prairie habitats are important. And then we can build on that and go beyond monarch butterflies to talk about pollinators in general and even insects in general and biodiversity in general. But it starts with the fact that people care about a butterfly species that they know and they grew up with. I think birds are another great way to talk to people about conservation, right? Everybody likes birds. Who doesn't like, well, there's a few people that don't like birds, but most people like birds. And the prairies have some really interesting birds. They have things like the bobolink that looks like a blackbird with a lobotomy that sings like R2D2 from Star Wars. And it's a species that people can get behind. You walk out in a prairie with a bobolink and they fly around your head and sing their mechanical sounding song. And they're really attractive and assertive and charming. But I think even beyond that, there's every species in the prairie has a really cool story. And I think one of the things that I've learned as a photographer is every time I take a picture of something, I can look it up, figure out what it is with help a lot of times. And then once I find the story, it's always a great story. So for example, you may or may not know that yucca, the spiny plants that live in a lot of the western parts of the world, but also there's probably yucca in places in Illinois and sandy soils, I would guess. Um, did you know that every species of yucca plant has a species of yucca moth that is the only pollinator of that flower? So the only way yucca makes seeds is because there's a moth species that specializes on yucca and it actually physically picks up pollen and delivers it within the flower to where it needs to go. It stuffs it inside the ovary and then lays an egg in there, or multiple eggs, so that when its larvae hatch, they can feed on the developing seeds of the yucca plant. But that's great for the moth, but maybe not for the yucca flower, right? If too many of those seeds get eaten, then the yucca plant doesn't get anything out of the relationship. So there's a really cool part of the story that I don't understand, but is really fascinating, which is that if there are a certain number of eggs or too many eggs laid inside the flower, the plant aborts the flower. It just lets the flower drop to the ground. And it basically gives up on the investment on that flower and focuses on others that have fewer eggs laid in it. Now, you explain to me how a plant knows how many eggs have been laid in its flower, and I'll give you a lot of money because I don't get it. Snakes are probably not the best place to start when you're trying to convince somebody that conservation or prairies are interesting or important, but I do think that there are a lot of snake species that are fascinating. And so, for example, if you know what this one is, go ahead and impress your friends by saying so. But if you don't, it's the eastern hognose snake. And hognose snakes have an upturned nose that they use to sort of dig toads out of the ground if the toad's sort of trying to cling to the ground and not be eaten by a snake. But they also have this really fascinating strategy of flattening their heads, making a scary hissing noise, and making them look really, really scary. They look like a venomous snake would look that's ready to attack. They're completely harmless to people and most other animals. And if the initial aggressive stature doesn't fool you, then they play their second card, which is to pretend to die. And they roll over on their back and they roil around on the ground and pretend they're dead. And then when they're done with that act, they just sort of stare at you for a while to see if you're going to go away. And the expression on their face, I just think is wonderful. As they hope that you're going to walk away and leave them alone. If you don't, then eventually they'll try to flee the scene. And I spend a lot of time looking at small things like insects, and so I'm excited about things like the cudweed grasshopper, which is a species of grasshopper that specializes on the cudweed sagewort or white sage that is its favorite food. And it's got a camouflage that so perfectly matches that plant that they're almost impossible to see unless you sort of brush your foot through a patch of white plants and you can see the little white grasshoppers hop out. Because otherwise they blend in just about perfectly. And it makes them one of my favorite grasshoppers. But my favorite insect of all is this one, which is the camouflage looper. It's a inchworm. It's a little caterpillar.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
We've identified that we've still got some people that we need to let in. So either we need to make a co-host or you need to let people in. It's probably easier if I make you co-host.
Let me see, actually. I can admit people. I'll just do it.
Okay.
I let 2 people in. Is there anybody else? I think that's it. I don't see anybody else in the waiting.
I can't see on this end, but that's probably.
Okay. I'll keep that window open. If I see other people, I'll just let them in.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure. No, not a problem. Welcome everybody who just joined. So the camouflage looper is this inchworm that feeds on flowers. But one of the cool things about it is that as it feeds on flowers, as it takes a bite of something, it also will take a piece of every once in a while, it'll skip eating a bite and it'll take a piece of flower and it'll turn around and stick it to its back. So it has a sticky saliva and there are little hooks on the back of it. So it can make itself look like whatever flower it is that it's feeding on, which is a really great strategy, especially for a little caterpillar that doesn't have much of a brain to speak of. But what really endeared me to this creature more than anything else was the one that you see on the picture here. I saw up at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, which is a nature conservancy site in Nebraska. And after I photographed it for a while, I took the flower that it was on and snipped it off low, and I took it back to headquarters with me so that I could show other people the next day. It was after hours, so everybody was gone. But I put the flower in some water, and then I put a different kind of flower with it that was a different color, because one of the things that the caterpillar will do is if it changes the flower and starts eating a different flower, of course, it changes its costume to match the new flower, because that's how it would stay camouflaged. And I was really hoping that I'd see a costume change overnight. So I put it in a glass of water, put a piece of paper towel underneath it to make sure that it didn't fall into the water and drown, put a glass over the top, and I made a little terrarium basically. And so when I finished that, I went to bed, and the next morning I got up to look at my little terrarium to see if the caterpillar had changed costume, and it had, but it didn't change costume to make itself purple with a new flower. Instead, it changed costume to match the dominant color in the new landscape that I had just put it in, which was that, of course, it made itself look like a paper towel. And if it hadn't been my favorite insect in the world at that point, it is now, right? That's pretty amazing. Okay, now I say all of that to lead into what I'm actually here to talk about tonight, which is my Hidden Prairie project. And the reason I wanted to have that intro is that one of the things that I was excited about with this Hidden Prairie project is that I'm always looking for ways to engage people in different ways about grasslands and to get them interested. And what I came up with as just one of many ideas was that there's a little bit of restored prairie here in Aurora, Nebraska, right out by the dog pound. And in this photo, if you look at the sort of the left side, there's a little bit of a white building, just mostly hidden behind a tree. That's the local dog pound. So there's all kinds of barking dogs. This is a very skinny little patch of prairie right here that was planted in 1980. It's got a little hiking trail right through the middle of it. So it's what I'm saying is it's nice, but it's nothing unique or special. Like it's a cool place because it's local, but there's nothing about this that is not that much different than a lot of other prairies. And so what I did is I went out in January in 2018 and I marked out 1 square meter with 4 yellow flags and made a promise to myself and people that read my blog that I was going to go out to this square meter plot multiple times, as many times as I could do it over the course of a year, and just see what I could find in that little square meter of prairie, with the idea of showing people how diverse and fascinating prairies can be. So here's another look at it in January. Doesn't look all that spectacular. And so over the next however many minutes I continue to talk, every photo you see now from here on out was taken within that square meter of prairie. And if you want statistics, I visited the site 46 times across that year. The average length was 30 minutes about. That went anywhere from like 10 minutes to an hour and a half. It depended on the day and how much I was seeing and what the weather and what the light was like for photography, all those sorts of things. And I did keep track of a tally of species that I found, although that wasn't really the point of the project. It was still interesting. And if you don't know the total, come up with a total number of species that you think I photographed in your head, and we'll see if you're right. But remember that it's not the number of species that I saw, it's the number of species I was able to get a good photograph of. And those are very different numbers because there are a lot of things that hopped or jumped or flew away before I got a chance to take a picture, right? So the total at the end of the year was 113 different species. That might sound like a lot, might not sound like a lot. It depends on your perspective. I was very happy with it. And it included 15 different kinds of plants. It included 22 different kinds of flies. That was the most diverse group of insects, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a minute. There were 18 different kinds of beetles. There were 14 different kinds of bees. And then 44 other species, wasps, spiders, all kinds of things that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But the point of the project was never to do an inventory, because there's lots of ways to do an inventory of how many species are in a site that are much easier than what I did. The point of it was to find some stories that I could tell to get people to engage with prairies. So let me tell you a couple stories, and I'll start with butterfly milkweed. When I selected the square meter that I wanted to study for a year, I didn't do it randomly. But I also tried not to pick the best plot in the prairie. I wanted something that was representative, but I did pick a plot that had butterfly milkweed because I thought it would be a really neat plant to follow. It attracts a lot of insects and pollinators especially, and I thought that would be a great way to have stories to tell. So I picked butterfly milkweed. The problem is, over the course of the year, the butterfly milkweed made lots of flowers, but I only saw one insect visit the plant, and it was this bug right here. which was really confusing to me because on the way into the plot, I would walk past other butterfly milkweeds that were just loaded with butterflies and bees and moths and all kinds of other things. And I'd get to my plot and I'd stop a long ways off and look from a distance. So it wasn't that I was scaring things away. There was never anything there. And I have no explanation for why that was. It was very frustrating. But as a result of that, that butterfly milkweed plant with lots of flowers made a single pod, which made me feel a little better because it wasn't just that I was missing all the activity on it. It was that there wasn't a lot of activity happening. So there was only enough pollination to make one seed pod off of this entire plant. And that one seed pod all of a sudden became very important to me because I was desperately interested in getting photographs of the little milkweed seeds when they come out of the pod. It's one of my favorite things to photograph anyway. And I was really hoping that that would be a part of this project. And so I waited for this pod to open. And when I went out one morning about 10:30 in the morning and it was just cracked open, like you see in this photo, I got really excited and I thought, okay, tomorrow, I'm coming back tomorrow. I'm going to be here when it starts to open. I'm going to start getting pictures of those seeds. And I went home. And about 4 hours later, it was 2:30 in the afternoon, and all I could think about was that seed pod on my one butterfly milkweed plant in my one little square meter plot. And I thought, what happens if it opens today and the wind blows all the seeds away? I'm going to be really upset. So I grabbed my camera gear, I went back over to the prairie, and when I got there, sure enough, it had started to open and some of the seeds were starting to emerge. So I took pictures of that afternoon. I went back the next day. I went out back the day after that. And I took way more pictures than I have time to show you, but I could show you picture after picture of butterfly milkweed seeds if you want. Some of them in the pods, some of them attached to other plants nearby. But the moral of the story, I got way more emotionally attached to a butterfly milkweed pod than I ever thought was possible. Another plant that was inside the plot was lead plant, which is a gorgeous little prairie shrub wildflower that I don't think people spend enough time looking at the flowers of. The flowers are really gorgeous. But each of the little blossoms is fairly small. It also attracts a lot of insects, some of which I hadn't really noticed on lead plant before, including this little beetle, which is called a clay-colored beetle. And once I started to notice it within my plot, hanging around lead plant, as I walked around that prairie and other prairies nearby, I started to see the same beetle on lead plant and started to figure out that, hey, this is a species that maybe is, I don't know if it specializes on lead plant, but it certainly favors lead plant as a food source, which is something I just didn't know before. There were also a lot of pollinators, things like this wasp. There's a beetle that was feeding on the pollen of the lead plant. This was exciting later when I got it identified because it turns out this is a bee that is a specialist on lead plant. So lead plant is one of the few plants that it feeds on. And in this little tiny prairie surrounded by the dog pound and the rest of our town, this bee that needs lead plant to survive had found lead plant and was making a living off of it, which was pretty neat. And then, of course, there were insects like the Japanese beetle, which is not an insect I was excited to see because it's an invasive plant. And if you have them in Illinois and have a garden, you probably know why I don't like them very much. And it was doing a lot of damage to some of the lead plant, but I don't think enough that it was a serious threat. And I still think at this point in Nebraska, I'm not super concerned about Japanese beetles and prairies. I'm more worried about the rhubarb in my yard than I am about prairies. And then lead plant later in the season, because I was in a place where I was trying to photograph whatever I could find, I started paying attention to things like the fall color on lead plant leaves, which I had just never thought about before. And it's really pretty. And then stiff sunflower is another plant that I was really excited about because it's one of my favorite plants anyway. And it's a great pollinator attractor. What I want to show you in this picture, if you haven't noticed them already, is there's 3 little beetles here. Here's a closer look at that little leaf beetle. I don't know the species of this beetle, but I've become very familiar with it since this project because I hadn't noticed it before, but I have noticed it every year since. And the reason I've noticed it every year since is this is what happened to all the stiff sunflower plants in my plot. Is that little beetle and all of its friends basically swarmed all over them, ate all the nectar, all the pollen, all the flowers themselves, shredded all the big petals on the outside of the ray flowers, really did a number on those plants and left them with almost no value to any other pollinator or insect. So I really didn't get a lot of pictures of insects on this sunflower species except for the beetle itself. And that's a story, right? And so I did get a story out of it and it was interesting. Here's another picture of it. You can see the light coming through it. And you can see a little beetle there hanging out on that petal. There were a couple that didn't get shredded by the beetle, but only because they got attacked by the Silphium head weevil, or head cutting weevil. And if you're not familiar with this species, it's another beetle. And what they do is they girdle the stem underneath the flower to the point where the flower almost falls off completely, but it definitely falls down. And the reason that scientists think they do that is that the next step is that they lay their eggs inside the flower. And then when the flower completely drops off, the eggs have hatched out, they feed on the inside of the flower, and then they just burrow straight into the ground. So by decapitating the flower, the weevil does two things. One, it provides a free ride down to the ground. But more importantly, other insects are much less likely to try to lay their eggs in that flowering head if it looks like the flower is dead. And so they sort of like mark their territory and keep other insect competition out by cutting that off and then laying their eggs inside. Again, great story, really neat. Fortunately, stiff sunflower is not the only species of sunflower in the plot. So within that same square meter, there were two different kinds of sunflowers growing. The other one was Maximilian sunflower, which in this case really saved the bacon because it was very attractive to pollinators. It gave me lots of insects to photograph. So here's 3 different insects on the same flower feeding at the same time. So there were little tiny pollinators, excuse me, like this little wasp. There were bigger pollinators like this big bumblebee. And then lots of things in between, including a cuckoo bee. If you don't know what a cuckoo bee is, you're all bird people, so you know what brown-headed cowbirds do, right? They're brood parasites. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests. Cuckoo bees do the same thing, except with bees. So most bees are solitary bees, meaning they're not like honeybees and bumblebees where there's a queen and workers. It's a single mom with a hole in the ground somewhere, and she lays eggs and brings food. And the cuckoo bee just sneaks in when she's out getting food, and the cuckoo bee female lays her egg in there and then disappears. And her offspring are the one that benefits from all the pollen and nectar that the single mom bee is bringing back. And similar to brown-headed cowbirds, it doesn't usually work out great for the host species, but it's a fascinating process. It's a really cool adaptation of a really interesting insect. And there's lots of different kinds of cuckoo bees. Here's one that was on Maximilian sunflower in my little plot. So more pictures of Maximilian sunflower. One of the things that happened late in the season of the Maximilian sunflowers was I started to see lots of these soldier beetles. And you probably have seen soldier beetles before. You might not know what they're called, but you'll probably recognize them, or at least many of you will. They're these little brown, leathery looking beetles, long, skinny beetles. And they feed on pollen. You can tell because they always have pollen on their faces as they work around in the flowers. And so I got lots of pictures of them. They posed really nice. They were really beautiful little beetles. So I took advantage of it and took lots of pictures of them in different poses. And then I got to the point where I had enough pictures of soldier beetles. And yet every time I tried to take a picture of a Maximilian sunflower, there was a soldier beetle on it. And I couldn't get away from soldier beetles for about 8 days. And so I would be trying to take a picture of a bee and there'd be a soldier beetle in the picture. Or another bee with a soldier beetle in the picture. Or this other bee with a soldier beetle in the background. And pretty soon it became really clear to me that soldier beetles were photobombing all of my shots. So there's a soldier beetle in this picture right there. There's a soldier beetle in this picture. Can you see it? Right there in the front. There's another one here, right in the background. So for 8 days, soldier beetles were everywhere. And then they were gone, just like that. Just snap of your fingers, and I didn't see any soldier beetles for the rest of the time. We talked about monarchs earlier, and I was really excited to see monarchs because, again, like as part of this project, I'm trying to get people interested in prairies. Monarchs are a good reason, a good way to do that. Didn't see any monarchs. Finally, I got there one morning. As I was walking in, I saw a monarch right on the edge of the plot. So I stopped from a distance. I put on a long telephoto lens and I got a picture before I walked in case it flew, and it did. So it's a good thing I got the picture. But then fortunately, a few days later, I was able to go back, and there was one that was sitting and sort of wet and cold in the early morning. I was able to get a couple better portraits of it because it wasn't as excited about flying off. And I want to circle back to flies, because if you remember, the most diverse group of species that I found in my plot was flies. And you might be surprised by that, but you shouldn't be, because, and this is a statistic I want everybody to remember and take home to your friends, which is that in North America, the most diverse group of insects is flies. And the estimated number of species of flies in North America, okay, come up with a number in your head. What do you think it is? And here's the number. There are 61,000 kinds of flies in North America. 61,000. That's an amazing number. So here's a test for you in your head. How many species of fly can you name? Because I bet you get past housefly and you start running into problems. Because fruit flies are a group, they're not a species. Same with horse flies. Deer fly maybe would be one. But most flies that we think we know are really a group of flies, and there's lots of species within that group. Mosquitoes are a kind of fly. Robber flies are a kind of fly. But again, there's lots of mosquitoes and lots of robber flies. So anyway, 61,000 kinds of flies. Shouldn't be surprised that that was the most diverse group in my plot. So you look at this picture of a fly and you think, okay, that looks like a house fly, but it's not. I can't tell you what it is because I don't know, but I know it's not a house fly. And neither is this, even though it looks a lot like a house fly. This looks a little different from a house fly, which is good because it is. This is a fruit fly. I can tell a fruit fly when I see them, but again, there's lots of species of fruit flies. This is definitely not a house fly. This is a picture wing fly that looks like it's wearing a gas mask. This little species, I did learn about this one. The males and females feed on rotting vegetation. And then the males, as a way to attract females, will regurgitate some of that rotting vegetation as like a brown liquid, and they'll let it sort of dangle from the end of its mouth. And apparently that's how they attract females. No one ever told me that that's attractive to females. That would have been really nice to know in high school. Some of these flies are really small. This is Indian grass. This is a stem of Indian grass just for scale. And that little tiny fly on the right-hand side is really tiny. There are flies that are these metallic green flies that are predatory. So this is a long-legged fly. It runs around mostly and catches things like ants. There are lots of pollinators that are flies. So these little hover flies, different species of them, they'll feed on all kinds of different flowers, including grass. Here's one that's feeding on Indian grass pollen. And some of those hover flies look a lot like bees. They're fuzzy. They have stripes and coloration that look a lot like a bee. If you want to know the difference, the easiest way usually to tell is that they have tiny little antennae and great big eyes. Bees have pretty good sized eyes too, but not as big as flies. And they tend to have long antennae, where flies, most of them have these little stubby antennae. I bet you don't know what this is, because I didn't either. If you do, I'm really impressed. What I thought it was when I saw it was the exoskeleton of some kind of insect, because it looked translucent in the early morning light. And I thought, well, that's great because it'll be easy to take a picture of. So I set up my tripod, got my camera ready, started taking pictures of this exoskeleton, this empty shell of something. And then it started to walk around, which was a little bit of freaky for me just for a minute. And then later in the year, I got another picture of it, either the same one or one of its friends, I'm not sure. And then I was able to get it identified. And it turns out it's a plant hopper. So it's a Durbid plant hopper, and it's got these gorgeous translucent colors on its wings, which look way too big for its body. It's one of the plant hoppers are one of the groups that, has a long, skinny mouth part that inserts into plants, and it just sort of sucks the juice out of plants. That's how it makes its living. There was another plant hopper species in the plot, this one, called the two-lined plant hopper, which is a pretty amazing replicate of a leaf, I think, and looks completely different than the other plant hopper, but has the same kind of life strategy. And then there were spiders. I think there were 7 different species of spider that I was able to photograph. I'm sure there were many more that I didn't, but that's what I got photos of. And some of them were web weavers that were making webs within the prairie to catch their plants, or their insects, but a lot of them were not. So some of them, like a lynx spider, are spiders that chase down their prey and catch them. So they have silk and they use silk for different things, but not to catch their prey. So I was able to photograph a lynx spider for the first time, actually. And then I photographed this little fly with a white abdomen. And then just a minute later, I was able to photograph them together because I got to watch the lynx spider creep up behind that fly and catch it. And then just a few days later, I found this spider, that's a little jumping spider that looks metallic and coppery color. And I got to also watch it hunt. And so I got to watch it catch its prey and feed on it for a while. It was like watching TV, watching a nature documentary, except it was in a little tiny plot outside. And then just because I got a good picture of it, here's the most charming spider of the whole bunch, I think, which is another jumping spider that looks like a teddy bear. And speaking of charming, I think praying mantises have a claim on one of the more charismatic of the species. Unfortunately, most of the big ones we see are in non-native invasive species, Chinese mantis, which is what this is, but they are really fun to look at. And they've got those little black pupils that looks like they have pupils in their eyes. They don't, of course, because they have compound eyes, right? So it doesn't make sense that they would have a pupil. But as you look at it and you move around, the pupil does look like it follows you. And it turns out that's just a trick of the light. It's a refraction of light through their eye that makes it look like they have a pupil, but they don't really. So these are three pictures of two Chinese mantises that were in the plot. Here's a different species of mantis. This is the European mantis, another non-native species. But they have a kind of a two-toned eye, which makes them a little bit easier to tell apart. Still very big. And the day that I photographed this mantis was my favorite day of the plot because I also got to photograph tree frog. And in Illinois, you guys have lots of tree frogs. You probably see them all the time in your prairies, which is great. In Aurora, Nebraska, we've only been seeing tree frogs for the last 10 years or so, maybe at the most. They're moving west across the state with trees, which is not a great sign for prairies, but it's a good thing for seeing tree frogs. This was the first tree frog I've ever photographed, and it was the first one I've ever seen in Aurora. And it was in my square meter plot, which I thought was pretty outstanding. And it was really patient with me and let me take pictures of it from lots of different angles, even after it jumped onto another planet, hung out for a little while, which was great. Okay, so what I'm doing now, this is a timed slideshow. I'm gonna let a bunch of pictures go by for the remainder of this very short period that I'm gonna talk. And what I want to talk about is I want to say that I was really surprised at how much this dumb little project resonated with people. I knew that I would enjoy it, well, I hoped I would enjoy it. And I really started it because I needed something to write about on my blog. Because writing a blog is a lot like being a preacher, where you're trying to say, basically, you're trying to tell the same stories in different ways every week, right? So I'm always looking for different angles and different things to talk about. And so I was hoping that this project would give me something new to talk about. But I was worried that one of the things that would happen to me is that when I was sitting looking at this tiny little area, I'd be missing a bunch of opportunities elsewhere to take pictures. Because when the light is good and there's not a lot of wind, as a photographer, I feel like I need to be out taking advantage of that. And I was worried that I'd be bored and frustrated by being stuck in one place for the whole time. And what turned out to be true was the opposite, which was that I would be walking around a big prairie somewhere else in Nebraska. And I was distracted because all I could think about was what I was missing out on in my little square meter back at home, which is not at all what I expected, right? And it has been really fun to see how much people have connected with this project and people that have tried to copy it in their own backyard, people that have told me about, doing a similar project with their kids, or nature centers that have tried to design a project like this for people to participate in when they come out to the site. And people are building their own little tiny Walden in some ways, and then studying it and watching it, which has been great. I've been really gratified by that. I feel like I completely lucked into that result because it's not what I expected. So I want to end with this photo. I've got a couple other things, but this is the last real photo from the project because this is, for me, an emblematic photo of the project. It was taken in May, and it was right about the point where I was trying to decide if it was really worth doing this project or not. Because the prairie, I was expecting that the prairie was going to get burned in the spring, and I had all these visions in my head of the, little plants emerging from the ash, and it would be really cool to take pictures of it. They didn't end up getting the plot burned, which means that my plant diversity was lower than I was hoping. There was nothing blooming by mid-May because there was a lot of thatch there. And I wasn't sure if this was going to be the project for me. But I was out in May and I was looking desperately for anything that would be interesting to take a picture of. And I noticed that I liked the way the light was coming through these Maximilian sunflower leaves. So I set up my tripod to take a picture of the leaf. And then I noticed that up and down the sunflower, there were a bunch of ants running back and forth. And I thought, well, okay, if I'm really patient and I set my tripod up and I just wait, one of those ants is probably going to run across this leaf and maybe I can get a picture of both of them together. And it took 10 minutes, but it actually did happen. And that 10 minutes of waiting very patiently for something like that to happen really flipped my brain in a way that made the whole project work from there on. Because it turned me into someone who was happy to find whatever was in front of me rather than to be disappointed by not seeing a particular thing at a certain time. And that philosophy has made me a better photographer since, because I'll be walking around in a prairie somewhere and I'm just not feeling inspired. I'm not seeing what I'm hoping to see. And every time, if I just sit down and look at everything that's right around me, there's always something to photograph. And once I find the first thing, then I find the second and the third and the fourth very quickly after that. It's been really helpful to me as a person. So to me, the upshots of this project were I was able to show people that there's a lot going on within a small area of prairie, which is one of my big goals. And I hope that it's an accessible project, because it's really, again, there was nothing particularly special about the prairie that I was in. It's no better than any prairie that you know anywhere in your neighborhood. I hope that it's helpful in terms of changing the way people think about prairies. And it was much more inspiring to me than I had expected. And I want to tie back to what I talked about at the very beginning real quick. You could summarize this project with a headline about 113 species that this weirdo with a camera found in a square meter of prairie. And that would be an accurate, if incomplete, description of the project, right? But I think the reason that it resonated with people was the stories. It was my enthusiasm. People came to the project because of my enthusiasm, and they connected with me rather than the plot, and then they were led to the plot after that. So the reason it was exciting was because I was excited about it. And I think that's a really good lesson for everybody. Like, all of us who care about nature and conservation can be storytellers in our own way. You don't have to do it my weird way. But I think if you remember that people engage with other people, if you talk about something that you care about, other people will find it interesting because they know that you care about it and they care about you. So Teresa said at the beginning, the book ended up, or the project ended up turning into a book called Hidden Prairie, which is great. If you're looking for a gift and you've got more money than it's worth to buy this book, please buy the book, because I used a university press and they don't market the book very much. And then it did turn into a museum exhibit, which was not at all expected, but it was really fun. It was a 6-month temporary exhibit in our state museum, Nebraska State Museum in Lincoln, the capital city. One of the best parts of that exhibit was I mean mostly them. They built 4 square meters of prairie, one for each season. We went out to a nearby prairie outside of Lincoln. We collected a bunch of plants. We brought them back in. The guy who builds exhibits preserved them in multiple ways. Some of them he dried, some he put in a glycol, or what's it called? Anyway, some chemical that replaced the fats with a different oil that doesn't degrade, and then painted the flowers to make them look right. And then we hid little insects inside the grass so that people could do my project, and they could stare at these little plots until they found all the different insects within it, which was fantastic. So that's my talk. That's the project. I hope it was interesting. And thanks for putting up with all the issues getting started. Appreciate it.
Chris, we do have time to entertain some questions, but because you're currently the host, you would have to unmute everyone.
I can try to do that. Are there questions from the crowd there while I do that?
I have one question. What got you started, or what gave you the idea for this project?
I mean, it's really what I said, which was looking for a different way to tell the same story about the diversity of life in prairies. And yeah, it was kind of one of those spur of the moment things that came to my brain, and I thought, well, it's worth a shot, and I tried it. And I'm looking here. I'm not sure that I can unmute anybody. I can ask all to unmute. It says I can mute all, but I don't have a way to unmute people.
Okay, so yeah, they could probably unmute themselves. As long as
Yes.
Yep, and I do have one person here that has a question as well.
Okay, great.
What was this pop-up shop at Generations with Bluebird Floral?
Yeah, I did. Saturday.
Yeah.
Oops.
Sorry, Teresa, what was the question?
Go ahead, Carol. Yep.
What was your favorite moment or favorite species of that?
What was my favorite species? That was the question.
Yes.
I mean, it's tempting to say the tree frog because that was pretty cool. But
Your concern?
it might, it might be that little Durbid plant hopper that I talked about, the one that I thought was an empty shell of something else, and then it started to move. That was definitely one of the more memorable ones. So that might end up being my favorite species, I think.
I'm just looking through the chat to see if there's any questions there. I don't see
Oh, great.
anything. Okay, we get one more question from the audience, though.
Okay.
She's asking what size is a meter?
So it'd be about the same as a yard. So 3 feet by 3 feet is what the size of the plot is. I tell people if you sit down cross-legged, you basically fill the space that I was looking at.
Prairie, is he gonna replicate the project again?
Can you?
Well, there's a couple of questions in the chat that I can answer. One of them was, did I use a macro lens for most of the photos? Yes. I was using a 105 millimeter macro lens, an old one that I still like. I just bought new camera gear about a month ago and I'm getting used to it, but my old camera gear was a Nikon D7100. It's a 10-year-old digital camera, nothing too super fancy. And I used a very old lens that I like. And then the other question was, how can you get the book? Hopefully you can get it anywhere that books are sold, but I know you can get it on Amazon. You can order it directly from University of Iowa Press if you'd like. And if it's not in your favorite gift shop or visitor center at a nature center near you, please ask them about it. Maybe they'll start selling it there. By the way, I make no money off of it. All the money goes to the Nature Conservancy. I wrote it on work time. So I'm not asking for myself. I'm just asking because I put a lot of work into making a book and I'd like people to see it.
Chris, one of the questions,
go ahead.
one of the questions in the audience is, do you have any plans to replicate the project in a different area?
I have definitely thought about it. I don't think so. I hope other people do. I think that would be great if other people did it. I've thought about doing another place. I've also tried to figure out like what's the next step, right? Like what's the next way to engage people on this kind of topic. And I just haven't come up with anything I'm excited about yet. This project took a lot of time. It took a good portion of my photography time in 2018. And I'm really grateful I did it, but I'm not sure I've got the patience or energy to do it again just yet. At least not at that scale or not in that intensity. And then Don's asking on the chat about the blog that I write, Prairie Ecologist. And it's how often do I write? I used to try to post twice a week. I'm at the point now where I'm trying to post at least once a week, sometimes twice, but usually once a week is pretty good. I have another job. I mean, it's part of my job to write the blog, but I still have lots of other things to do, so it's hard to pull away. But one of the things that I've found about the blog is that it helps me maintain my curiosity because when I'm out in nature, out in prairies, I'm thinking about things that I could photograph or stories that I could tell on the blog, which makes me think differently when I'm in the prairie. So I'm really grateful for the pressure to write because I think it really does help me be a more engaged person out in the grass. And then Kyle's asking, what percentage of the insects was I able to identify immediately? Very few. And which insect took the longest to identify? And how long and what was the source for identification? So here's the thing with me. I take pictures of insects a lot, and I think I have a decent amount of knowledge about insects, but I'm definitely not an insect expert. I'm an insect enthusiast. And people assume that I know insects, and I know that because they send me pictures of insects to identify, and I'm not much help. I know the ones that I have pictures of, and even there, sometimes I have to look on my own blog to remember what it's called. So the way I identify a lot of them is a combination of either Bug Guide, which is a really nice site if you're a photographer and you take pictures of insects. Bugguide.net is a really nice way to get them identified. And then they live in a library that can help other people identify insects. So that's a good source. And then I have a series of friends that I've gained over time who know a lot more about insects than I do, and they're willing to help if I send them a picture. I don't know which insect took the longest to identify. I'm not sure I would remember that. And there are still some insects that even within the last year or two, I knew it was in a group of insects, and someone has been able to tell me what species it was or what genus it was at least. So there's still, I would say it's still an ongoing process. Invertebrates are just hard. There's so many of them. I mean, 61,000 kind of flies, for example. I think that's all the questions in the chat that I've seen.
I don't see anybody else here indicating that they have questions either. I know that there's at least one person in the room that's motivated to do this 1 meter square project, and I'm guessing you probably motivated several people to consider doing that as well. We've actually had some
Good.
discussions at our board meeting to offer a program at a couple of our preserves in that regard. So stay tuned for more on that.
Yeah, let me know if you try it. That'd be great.
Okay, we will. Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate the program. It was excellent.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.